right, ready to dive deep. Today we're looking at John Mearsheimer's take on the war in Ukraine. And, it's pretty wild. He thinks Trump's foreign policy moves hint at some big changes coming on the global stage.
Yeah, and it is fascinating, isn't it? Because he's not just looking at what's happening right now. He goes way back,
Right.
arguing that what we see now, this conflict, it all stems from this Western push, to expand NATO and the EU eastward, like really set off alarm bells over in Moscow and, really laid the groundwork for the conflict we're seeing today.
Yeah, and he's not exactly holding back when it comes to criticizing the West's response, is he?
Not at all.
He's basically saying we're in fantasy land, ignoring the reality on the ground. Like Russia is gaining ground and we've kind of already lost this proxy war. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Mearsheimer suggests that Trump might be about to accept Russia's demands.
Oh, wow.
Which could mean, a neutral Ukraine and even acknowledging Russia's hold on Crimea and the Donbass.
Yeah, that's massive, right? I mean, especially for the Ukrainians who have been fighting tooth and nail this whole time.
Absolutely.
It would be a really bitter pill to swallow.
For sure.
But Mirsheimer goes even further. He suggests that the U.S. might be getting ready to pull back from Europe altogether.
Whoa, hold on.
Leaving the Europeans to sort out their own security arrangements.
So wait, he's suggesting that after, decades of being the security guarantor for Europe, the U.S. might just walk away. What would that even look like?
Well, think about it. The U.S., they've been the backbone of NATO, right? Providing military support, acting as a deterrent against Russian aggression.
Right.
If they step back, it creates a huge power vacuum in Europe.
Huge.
And Mearsheimer's saying the U.S. is basically admitting defeat, recognizing that they can't win this proxy war in Ukraine, and deciding to cut their losses.
So it's not just about Ukraine, then. It's about the U.S. recognizing like a fundamental power shift globally and deciding, okay, let's prioritize other areas, maybe focusing on this competition with China. But wouldn't that make Europe even more unstable, stepping away like that? Wouldn't that risk even more conflict down the road?
It's a risky move, for sure. But Mearsheimer argues that trying to hold on to this old order, this world where the U.S. is the top dog, that's a losing battle. He's saying the world's changing and the U.S. needs to adapt or get left behind. He also brings up something kind of surprising. He actually thinks Russia might prefer the U.S. to stay involved in Europe.
Wait, really? Why? I always thought they saw the U.S. as their main rival.
Well, remember, Mearsheimer's coming at this from a realist perspective, right? Focused on power dynamics and national interests. And he argues that Russia sees the U.S. presence in Europe as a stabilizing factor.
So it's like having the U.S. there helps keep things in check, prevents one country from getting too powerful or, rocking the boat too much.
Exactly. And that actually lines up with what Russia itself wanted at the end of the Cold War. They actually preferred the U.S. staying involved to prevent, say, Germany from becoming too strong and potentially causing trouble.
Interesting. So we have this weird situation where it seems everyone wants the U.S. to stay in Europe. Europeans, Russians, maybe even the U.S. itself to some extent. But at the same time, the U.S. is clearly signaling they're ready to shift focus elsewhere, especially with China's rise.
Right, and that takes us to the core of Mearsheimer's argument, doesn't it?
Yeah.
He believes the world is moving away from this U.S.-dominated system, this unipolar system, toward a multipolar one where power is more spread out, more balanced. And he sees the war in Ukraine as a symptom of this shift, like a sign that the old rules are breaking down. We need new ones.
So what would these new rules look like? What's Mearsheimer's vision for this new world order?
He argues that it has to involve acknowledging Russia as a major player, taking their security concerns seriously, and creating this new security structure in Europe, one that includes Russia, not excludes it. But, and this is a big but, he thinks the West, especially the U.S., really needs to get past its ideological biases and adopt a more pragmatic, realist approach.
So he's basically saying we're stuck in this mindset where we see ourselves as the good guys promoting democracy and freedom, and we see Russia as the bad guys who need to be, contained or even overthrown. But in this new multipolar world, that kind of black and white thinking just won't work anymore.
Exactly. He says this ideological blind spot has led to a totally distorted view of Russia, like painting Putin as this uniquely evil figure who wants to take over the world. Mearsheimer pushes back against that, arguing that Putin's acting rationally, even if ruthlessly, to protect Russia's interests.
And he points to specific actions by the West, right?
Yeah.
Things like NATO expansion, EU expansion, support for those color revolutions, all these things that have contributed to Russia's sense of insecurity and fueled its aggression. But even if we don't agree with Russia's perspective, Mearsheimer says it's crucial to understand it if we want to find a way out of this whole mess. He argues that by refusing to acknowledge Russia's legitimate security concerns, we've actually made the situation worse, dragged out the conflict, and made a peaceful resolution even harder to reach.
And he makes this really striking point. He says that this narrative we hear in the West, about Ukraine winning and Russia being on the verge of collapse,
Yeah.
it's not just wishful thinking. He says it's actually dangerous.
So he's suggesting that our own biases are leading us to support policies that are actually hurting the very people we claim to be helping, the Ukrainians. That's a serious accusation.
It is. He's not afraid to ruffle some feathers and challenge, the accepted wisdom. He says that instead of dwelling on how we wish the world was, we need to deal with how it is. That means recognizing Russia's strength, accepting their demands, and negotiating a peace deal, even if it's painful for Ukraine because it's the least bad option available.
Wow, that's a lot to process. So is he right? Is the West really stuck in this ideological trap? Have we totally misread Russia? And what are the implications of this potential U.S. shift away from Europe?
Those are some big questions, aren't they?
Huge.
And Mearsheimer's analysis offers this really unique and often uncomfortable perspective on the war in Ukraine and what it means for the world. It's a perspective that really challenges conventional wisdom, forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths, and makes us rethink our whole understanding of the world.
And that's the value of deep dives like this.
Right, absolutely.
We're diving deep, not to tell you what to think, but to give you the tools to think for yourself. And in this case, those tools include a healthy dose of realism, a bit of historical context, and a lot of critical thinking.
It's about engaging with the ideas, right?
Exactly.
So as you think through Mearsheimer's analysis, ask yourself, what resonates with you? What challenges your assumptions? And what new insights have you gained about this complex and rapidly changing world?
Because the world's not waiting for us to catch up. We have to keep learning, keep adapting, and keep asking these tough questions.
And that's what we're here to help you do.
Stay tuned for part 2 of this deep dive where we'll explore Mearsheimer's analysis even further.
So picking up where we left off, one of Mearsheimer's most I guess you could say controversial points is that the 2008 NATO decision to open the door to Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO was a big mistake, a blunder even.
Okay.
And he argues that this move, along with EU expansion and the West's support for all those color revolutions, it's
poking the bear.
Yeah, exactly. Poking the bear, waving a red flag in front of a bull, it triggered this deep anxiety in Moscow.
It's like we kept pushing and pushing, and now we're surprised they pushed back.
Right. And he goes beyond just saying, oh, we provoked Russia. He says this constant push eastward created a security dilemma.
A dilemma.
Yeah, where our attempts to make ourselves safer actually made Russia feel less secure. It's this vicious cycle that just spiraled into war.
Oh, I see.
And this is where his realist perspective really comes through. He's basically saying we were totally blind to Russia's point of view. We assumed they would just kind of passively accept these moves, but they saw it as an existential threat, and they reacted accordingly.
Right. Makes sense.
It also ties into his critique of what he calls liberal hegemony, this idea that the West should be promoting democracy and liberal values all over the world, even if it means using force.
So he's suggesting our good intentions, backfired. That trying to spread democracy actually created more instability and conflict.
That's exactly what he's saying.
Wow.
He argues this approach is naive and ultimately counterproductive. He thinks we need a more humble foreign policy, one that acknowledges the different political systems out there, and focuses on promoting stability and cooperation rather than, forcing our values on others.
Okay, so that's a big change from how the West has been operating for decades. I mean, if we actually adopted this realist perspective that he's talking about, what would that even look like? I mean, what would we do differently?
Well, he outlines a few key steps.
Okay.
First, we have to acknowledge that Russia is a major power with its own legitimate security interests, and we need to find ways to accommodate those interests.
Okay.
That means giving up on this idea of expanding NATO further east. We should be working towards a new security architecture in Europe that includes Russia, not excludes them.
So instead of treating Russia as an enemy we need to contain, we start treating them as a partner, or at least an equal player. Right.
Exactly. Second, we have to ditch this idea of regime change in Russia. Mearsheimer believes trying to topple Putin or force Russia to become a liberal democracy, it's just a fool's errand.
Right.
It'll only lead to more instability and conflict.
It's almost like he's saying, let Russia be Russia, even if we don't like their system.
Yeah.
Focus on finding common ground in areas where we can cooperate instead of trying to force them into a mold that doesn't fit.
Exactly. And third, we got to be realistic about our own limitations. The U.S. can't be the world's policeman anymore, right? We can't solve every problem or jump into every crisis. We need to pick our battles, focus our resources on the most important challenges.
Right.
And for Mearsheimer, that means shifting our focus away from Europe and toward the Indo-Pacific, mostly to deal with China.
Okay, so this is where that big pivot comes in, right? The idea that the U.S. is gradually shifting its attention from Europe to Asia. But what happens if the U.S. does step back from Europe? What then?
That's the big question, isn't it? And Mearsheimer isn't exactly optimistic about Europe's ability to step up and fill that void. He points to all these deep divisions within Europe, political and economic divisions.
Right.
And he argues that it's going to be really hard for them to agree on a common defense policy or to act decisively on the world stage.
So he's painting kind of a bleak picture here. A declining U.S., a divided Europe, and a more and more assertive Russia. It doesn't exactly sound like a recipe for peace and stability.
No, it doesn't. But remember, Mearsheimer's a realist, not a pessimist. He's not saying that war and conflict are inevitable. He's saying we need to understand the forces at play, recognize the challenges, and make hard choices based on a clear-eyed view of our own interests and capabilities.
So it's like a wake-up call, right? The world's changing, and we better adapt if we want to avoid disaster.
Exactly. It's a really timely and thought-provoking message. Even if it's not always easy to hear, I mean, those are the questions we really need to be thinking about, because the choices we make now, well, they'll have consequences for years to come.
Yeah, I know. It's a lot to wrap your head around. All this geopolitical stuff playing out on the world stage. It can feel pretty overwhelming.
It really can.
Where does that leave us? Like as individuals, how do we even start to make sense of it all? And maybe, find a little bit of hope amidst all the uncertainty and chaos.
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And while Mearsheimer doesn't really offer, easy answers or feel-good platitudes,
right,
his analysis does give us some clues about how to navigate these crazy times.
So instead of freaking out, we should be trying to understand what's happening in the world, what's shaping the world around us.
Yeah.
And then making smart choices based on that understanding.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, right?
Right.
Especially in a world where we're just bombarded with information and a lot of it is meant to mislead us.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And he's not just saying stay informed. He's also saying be skeptical.
Right.
Question the narratives we're being fed by politicians and the media. Seek out different perspectives.
It's about critical thinking, not just passively accepting everything we're told. It's about grappling with complex issues, even when they don't have easy answers.
So it's not about burying our heads in the sand or just giving in to despair.
No.
It's about engaging with the world in a more informed and thoughtful way.
Right. And that engagement, it can take many forms, right? It might mean, learning more about global affairs, having conversations with people who have different views, or even getting involved in political activism or advocacy.
Yeah. The point is to not feel powerless, to recognize that even though these challenges seem huge, even daunting,
right,
we can still make a difference.
Absolutely. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is just refuse to accept the status quo. Keep asking questions, keep pushing for a better future.
I like that. So to wrap things up here, Mearsheimer's analysis, it paints a pretty stark picture, a pretty unsettling picture of the world, honestly.
It does.
But it's a view that forces us to face reality, to let go of our illusions and make some tough choices.
Right.
And by doing that, maybe, just maybe, we can figure out how to get through these turbulent times with a bit more awareness, a bit more clarity, and even, maybe even a glimmer of cautious optimism.
Maybe, because, the future is uncertain. But one thing is for sure, the choices we make today, they're shaping the world of tomorrow.
And that's something worth thinking about deeply.
Subscribe to our podcast available on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.